Chosen one, if you have been carrying something for a long time, if you have been waiting for an answer that seemed like it would never come, then listen carefully to what this message is pointing toward, because this Sunday is not being presented as just another day on the calendar. It represents a turning point, a moment when something that has felt painfully repetitive may finally begin to change. You have gone through seasons where you wondered why the same struggle kept appearing in different forms. You tried to move forward, but something seemed to pull you back. You prayed, waited, hoped, and sometimes questioned whether anything was changing at all. And perhaps the hardest part was not the battle itself. It was not knowing when it would end. That is what makes this moment so powerful. Because when you have been waiting for something for a long time, you eventually stop asking, "How will this happen?" You start asking, "When will this finally be over?" And that is the question sitting underneath this entire message. This Sunday represents the possibility of a new chapter beginning after a season that has taken more patience from you than you expected. But there is something important you need to understand. The ending of a long battle does not always look like a dramatic event. Sometimes it begins with a decision. Sometimes it begins with a door opening. Sometimes it begins when something that once had power over your thoughts suddenly stops controlling you. And sometimes the first sign of change is simply that you realize you are no longer the same person who entered that difficult season. You have learned things. You have become more aware. You have discovered what you can no longer carry. And you have started recognizing what deserves your attention and what does not. That is why the phrase, "your longest battle is finally over," should not only make you think about something happening outside of you, it can also point towards something changing within you. The battle may have been teaching you what you needed to know before you could recognize the next chapter. And this is where the story becomes deeper. Because if everything had changed immediately, would you have understood its value? If the answer had arrived before you were ready, would you have recognized it? If the door had opened before you understood which direction you were actually supposed to take, would you have walked through it? Sometimes the waiting period changes the person who receives the answer. And that may be why your journey has felt longer than expected. Not because nothing was happening, but because not everything happening was visible. There were lessons you could not see while you were inside the situation. There were connections you could not understand at the time. There were endings that looked like losses but later revealed themselves as protection. And there were moments when you thought you were being pushed backward when in reality you were being redirected. So when you hear that this Sunday could represent a turning point, do not think only about one magical moment. Think about the larger transition. The old chapter has been teaching you. The new chapter is asking you to recognize what you have learned. And there is one question we need to answer before we can understand what this new chapter means. Why did the battle last so long in the first place? Because that answer changes everything. Maybe you thought the delay meant rejection. Maybe you thought the silence meant you had been forgotten. Maybe you looked at other people's lives and wondered why their doors seemed to open while yours remained closed. But comparison can make a waiting season feel much longer than it actually is. Your journey was never required to look like someone else's. And the fact that something took time does not automatically mean it was meaningless. Sometimes time reveals what urgency hides. Time exposes motives. Time reveals which relationships are genuine. Time shows you what you actually want. And time can make you strong enough to walk away from what once seemed impossible to leave. That is why the end of a battle can be much bigger than the arrival of one blessing. It can mean the end of an old pattern, the end of constant fear, the end of waiting for someone else's approval, the end of returning to situations that repeatedly drained your peace, the end of believing that your future must look like your past. And perhaps this is the real reason this Sunday matters. Not because a date on a calendar has magical power, but because you may be approaching a moment where you finally recognize that the chapter you have been fighting through does not have to define the chapter you enter next. So before we go deeper, remember this. You do not have to understand every detail of your journey to move forward. You only need to recognize what is changing, because something can end before you have the words to explain it. And sometimes the first evidence that a season is ending is that your heart begins to expect something different. That expectation is where we are going next, because there is a reason you may be feeling that something is shifting, and once you understand that reason, the last part of this long battle may begin to make much more sense. There is something about a long season of waiting that most people do not understand until they have lived through it. Waiting changes your perspective. At first, you are focused on the outcome. You want the answer. You want the opportunity. You want the door to open. You want the situation to finally make sense. But after enough time passes, something deeper begins to happen. You start becoming aware of yourself. You begin noticing the patterns you ignored before. You recognize the people who only appeared when things were going well. You recognize the situations that repeatedly took your peace. You recognize the difference between what you wanted and what you actually needed. And that kind of understanding cannot always be rushed. This is why your longest battle may have been preparing you in ways you never expected, not preparing you to suffer forever, preparing you to recognize the difference between an old chapter and a new one. Think about how different you are now compared with the person who first entered that difficult season. Maybe you tolerate less confusion. Maybe you question less whether you are worthy of good things. Maybe you have stopped chasing people who do not choose you. Maybe you have become more careful about where you place your energy. Maybe you finally understand that peace is not something you should constantly have to fight to keep. Those changes matter, because when the next opportunity appears, you may not respond to it the way you would have responded months or years ago. You may recognize it faster. You may have the courage to say yes, or perhaps you will finally have the courage to say no. Both can be signs of growth. And this is where the meaning of "this Sunday changes everything" becomes more practical. A turning point does not necessarily mean that every problem disappears overnight. It can mean that your direction changes, your decisions change, your expectations change, your boundaries change, your understanding changes. And once those things change, the future can begin moving in a completely different direction. There is another important piece here. You may have spent so much time focusing on what you lost that you forgot to ask what the loss taught you. You may have focused so much on the closed door that you never considered what that door was keeping you from. You may have been so disappointed by the delay that you overlooked the strength you developed during it. That does not mean every painful experience was meant to happen. It means that even difficult seasons can contain lessons, and those lessons can become useful when the season changes. This is why you should not measure your future by your most difficult chapter. A chapter is not the whole story. A delay is not the same as a denial. A closed door is not proof that every door is closed. And a difficult season is not evidence that your entire future will be difficult. There is still more ahead. But now we reach another question. If something is changing, how will you recognize it? Because sometimes people expect transformation to arrive with fireworks. They expect a giant sign. They expect everything to become obvious immediately. But real change can begin quietly. A conversation may happen. An opportunity may appear. A decision may become easier. Something you once felt attached to may suddenly lose its hold over you. You may receive information that changes your perspective. You may discover that a path you had been trying to force was never the path that fit you. And suddenly, what felt like rejection starts looking like redirection. That is why you should pay attention to patterns, not just dramatic moments. Pay attention to what repeatedly brings clarity. Pay attention to what gives you a sense of purpose. Pay attention to opportunities that align with your values and responsibilities. Pay attention to the people who encourage you to grow, rather than keeping you trapped in an old version of yourself. And pay attention to your own decisions, because the end of a battle can sometimes begin when you stop participating in the battle in the same way. You stop arguing with every person who misunderstands you. You stop trying to prove yourself to everyone. You stop explaining your worth. You stop revisiting the same situation hoping it will suddenly become different. And you begin choosing peace. That is powerful, not because it guarantees a particular outcome, but because it gives you control over the part of the story that belongs to you. You cannot control every door. You cannot control every person's choices. You cannot control the timing of every opportunity, but you can control how you respond. You can prepare. You can learn. You can make wise decisions. You can keep moving, and you can remain open to possibilities without convincing yourself that every coincidence is a supernatural sign. This balance matters, because hope should not make you passive. Hope should make you ready. So if this Sunday represents a turning point for you, let it represent readiness. Be ready to recognize an opportunity. Be ready to release an outdated expectation. Be ready to make a decision you have been postponing. Be ready to step into a new environment. Be ready to stop carrying something that no longer belongs in your next chapter. And most importantly, be ready to understand that the ending of one battle is not the end of your story. It may be the moment when your story finally begins to move in a new direction, but there is still one thing we have not uncovered. What exactly should you look for when the change begins? Because the signs may be much simpler than you expect, and once you recognize them, You may realize that the ending you were waiting for was not arriving all at once. It was already beginning. Now we come to the part that many people overlook. When a long season begins to change, the first sign is not always an external miracle. Sometimes the first sign is clarity. You suddenly know what you cannot keep doing. You suddenly know what conversation needs to happen. You suddenly know which opportunity deserves your attention. You suddenly understand why a certain situation could not continue the way it had been continuing, and that clarity can feel surprisingly ordinary, but ordinary does not mean unimportant. A single clear decision can change the direction of an entire year. So if you are entering this Sunday with the feeling that something needs to change, do not ignore that feeling, but do not turn every emotion into a prediction either. Instead, ask better questions. What needs to end? What needs to begin? What have I learned? What am I still holding on to? What decision have I been avoiding? What opportunity have I been too afraid to consider? Those questions can reveal more than simply waiting for something external to happen, because the next chapter may require participation. You may need to take a step. You may need to apply. You may need to communicate. You may need to forgive. You may need to establish a boundary. You may need to leave an unhealthy pattern. You may need to learn something new. You may need to give yourself permission to start again. That is why the phrase, "your longest battle is finally over," should not be interpreted as permission to stop growing. It is an invitation to stop living as though the battle is permanent. There is a difference. When you believe the battle is permanent, you organize your entire identity around surviving it. You wake up expecting another problem. You expect disappointment. You expect another delay. You expect people to leave. You expect opportunities to disappear. And eventually, even when something good appears, you may struggle to trust it. But when you begin believing that life can change, you start responding differently. You prepare for possibility. You become willing to try. You become willing to hope without demanding certainty. You begin seeing yourself as someone who can build a future rather than someone who can only survive the past. That shift matters. And perhaps that is what this Sunday can symbolize for you. A line between two ways of thinking. Behind you. What if nothing changes? All. Ahead of you. What if something can? Behind you. I have already lost too much. Ahead of you. I can still build something meaningful. Behind you. I have been waiting forever. Ahead of you. I can take the next step. This does not erase everything that happened. It gives those experiences a different place in your story. They become chapters you live through, not sentences that define you. And there is another sign you should watch for. Sometimes the end of a long battle comes with a surprising lack of interest in the old conflict. Something that once consumed your thoughts no longer does. Someone who once controlled your mood no longer has the same power. A situation you once desperately wanted suddenly feels less important. You begin realizing that you were not waiting for that specific thing. You were waiting for peace. And once you begin finding peace, you understand that the real blessing may have been bigger than the original request. This is why you should not limit the meaning of a blessing to money, possessions, status, or one particular outcome. A blessing can also be wisdom, a healthy relationship, a second chance, a new skill, a peaceful environment, a restored sense of purpose, a better opportunity, a healthier decision, a new beginning. And sometimes the blessing is simply realizing that you have the strength to begin again. Now, imagine reaching the end of a long road and discovering that the road itself changed you. You are not walking into the future empty-handed. You are carrying experience. You are carrying lessons. You are carrying a deeper understanding of what matters. You are carrying evidence that you survived difficult moments before and that changes how you approach what comes next. So as Sunday approaches, instead of asking only, "What is going to happen to me?" ask, "What am I ready to do differently?" That question puts you in a stronger position because you do not need to predict the future to prepare for it. You do not need certainty about every detail. You need awareness. You need patience. You need wisdom. You need courage. And if an opportunity appears, evaluate it carefully. If a door opens, look at where it leads. If someone returns, consider whether their actions have changed. If something ends, allow yourself to learn from it. If something begins, give it room to develop. Do not rush to label every event as a miracle. Let the meaning become clear through time, evidence, and wise choices. That is how you protect your hope without losing your judgment. And now we are approaching the deepest part of this message. Because perhaps the greatest change is not something that happens around you. Perhaps it is the moment you stop seeing yourself as someone trapped inside an endless battle. The battle may have been real. The disappointment may have been real. The waiting may have been exhausting. But none of those things have to become your permanent identity. You are allowed to enter another chapter. You are allowed to believe that better days are possible. You are allowed to build again. You are allowed to move forward without having every answer. And this is where the meaning of Sunday becomes much clearer. It is not about treating one date as a guarantee. It is about recognizing a moment of transition. A moment when you decide that the old chapter has taught you enough. A moment when you stop asking only why it happened and begin asking what you will do with what you learned. Because that is where the real turning point begins. And the final question is this. If the battle is ending, what are you going to do with the life waiting on the other side? Part 4, the chapter after the battle. Chosen one, this is where everything comes together. Maybe the ending you were waiting for was never supposed to be a single dramatic moment. Maybe it was a process of becoming stronger, a process of becoming wiser, a process of learning what deserves your energy, a process of discovering what you can live without, a process of understanding that your future does not have to repeat your past. And if this Sunday becomes a meaningful turning point for you, let it be the beginning of something intentional. Do not wait for life to become perfect before you move. Do not wait until every question has an answer. Do not wait until fear completely disappears. Sometimes courage is simply moving forward while you are still uncertain, and perhaps that is the final lesson of your longest battle. You were never meant to spend your entire life proving that you could survive it. At some point, survival has to become living. At some point, waiting has to become preparation. At some point, preparation has to become action. And at some point, the person you became during the difficult season has to step into the new chapter. That is the transition, not perfection. Progress, not certainty. Direction, not knowing everything. Knowing the next step. So when you think about this Sunday, do not put your entire future on one date. Instead, use it as a reminder that chapters can end, a reminder that circumstances can change, a reminder that people can grow, a reminder that opportunities can appear unexpectedly, a reminder that you can make a different decision, a reminder that your past does not have unlimited authority over your future. And if something has been weighing on you for a long time, perhaps this is the moment to ask yourself whether you are still carrying it because it belongs in your future, or because you became accustomed to carrying it. That question can be uncomfortable, but it can also be freeing, because sometimes the thing keeping us in an old chapter is not the chapter itself. It is our belief that we cannot leave it. You can learn something new. You can choose a healthier direction. You can ask for help when you need it. You can stop repeating an old pattern. You can take one small step toward something better. And you can do all of this while keeping your faith, your hope, and your judgment together. That is a powerful combination. Faith does not require you to ignore reality. Hope does not require you to pretend everything is already solved. And moving forward does not require you to know exactly what happens next. It only requires you to take the next wise step. Maybe the door you have been waiting for will open in a way you did not expect. Maybe an opportunity will appear. Maybe a relationship will change. Maybe you will discover a new direction. Maybe something you thought you needed will no longer matter. Maybe the biggest breakthrough will be internal. Whatever form the next chapter takes, recognize this. You are not obligated to remain emotionally trapped in the chapter that hurt you. You can remember without reliving. You can learn without remaining stuck. You can honor what happened without allowing it to define everything that happens next. And that is why the end of a long battle can be so meaningful. It is not simply about saying, "It is finally over." It is about saying, "I am ready for what comes next." Those are very different statements. The first looks backward, the second looks forward. So let this Sunday be a marker, not a magical guarantee, not a reason to ignore reality, a marker, a point where you decide that the lessons of the past will help you build the future. A point where you stop measuring your life only by what has not happened yet. A point where you begin noticing what is already changing. And when something good begins to appear, do not immediately dismiss it because it looks smaller than you imagined. A new chapter often begins quietly. One conversation, one decision, one opportunity, one realization, one brave step, then another, until one day you look back and realize that the life you are living is no longer the life you were trying so hard to escape. That is transformation. Not always loud, not always immediate, but real. So if you have been waiting, breathe. If you have been disappointed, give yourself permission to hope again. If you have been afraid, take one wise step. If you have been holding on to something that no longer serves your future, begin releasing it. And if this Sunday brings an opportunity to begin again, recognize it. You do not need to know the entire road. You only need enough courage to take the next step. Because perhaps the most important thing waiting for you is not simply the end of a difficult chapter. Perhaps it is the realization that you are capable of writing what comes after it. Your longest battle does not have to become your longest identity. Your waiting season does not have to become your permanent home. Your past does not get to make every decision about your future. There can be more. There can be growth. There can be peace. There can be new opportunities. There can be unexpected answers. There can be a chapter you have not imagined yet. So as you enter this Sunday, carry this thought with you. The chapter may be changing, and you can change with it. Do not chase signs. Do not force outcomes. Do not assume that every coincidence is a message. Instead, stay awake to possibility. Stay grounded. Stay thoughtful. Stay hopeful. And when the right door appears, be ready to recognize it. Because sometimes the breakthrough is not the moment everything outside of you changes. Sometimes the breakthrough is the moment you realize you are finally ready to walk forward. That may be the real ending of the battle. Not that life will never be difficult again, but that difficulty no longer gets to convince you that there is no future beyond it. There is, and whatever this next chapter brings, meet it with wisdom, courage, patience, and hope. This Sunday can be a reminder that endings and beginnings often exist in the same moment. One chapter closes, another begins. And the person who walks into that new chapter does not have to be the same person who entered the old one. You have learned, you have grown, you have endured. Now let those lessons become part of what you build next. The battle was a chapter. It does not have to be the whole story. And perhaps that is the message you needed to hear today. You are allowed to move forward. You are allowed to begin again. You are allowed to expect something better while still remaining grounded in reality. And you are allowed to believe that your next chapter can be different from your last. So take the next step. Let the old chapter stay where it belongs. And walk toward what comes next. Not because you know every detail, but because you finally understand that your story is not finished. This Sunday does not have to be the end of your journey. It can be the moment you recognize that a new one has begun.